Spring had barely arrived when Linda Morrison, the self-appointed queen of the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association, decided that Ethan Carter's vacant lot was an eyesore too offensive to ignore for one more season, without asking, without knocking on a single door, without so much as a courtesy phone call to the man whose name appeared on every legal document tied to that land. She hired a landscaping crew, signed contracts using HOA letterhead she had no authority to use for private property, and within 48 hours had transformed an empty piece of earth into what she proudly called a neighborhood beautification project. Nearly 50 red maple trees went into the ground. Irrigation lines snaked beneath the soil. Decorative stone borders framed freshly laid sod like a painting in a gallery that didn't belong to her. Linda stood at the edge of it all with her hands on her hips and smiled the smile of a woman who believed, with absolute certainty, that she had just done something wonderful. 3 weeks later, 6 excavators rolled onto that same land at sunrise, and by the time the sun dipped below the western tree line, every single maple she had planted was gone. Ethan Carter was 39 years old, a structural engineer by trade and by temperament, a man who measured twice before cutting once, who understood that the most powerful response to chaos was not a louder version of chaos, but precision. He had spent 15 years designing load-bearing systems for commercial buildings across 3 states, and in that time he had learned something most people never do, that the law, when applied correctly and patiently, is the most devastating force available to a private citizen. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. He drove a truck that was 4 years old and lived in a modest rental across town, while he saved for something more meaningful. Ethan had purchased the vacant lot on Sycamore Crest Lane 18 months earlier with a very specific purpose in mind, not to build for himself, but to build for his parents. His father, Raymond Carter, had spent 32 years working as a mail carrier. His mother, June Carter, had taught 3rd grade for 27 years, before her knees gave out and she retired on a fixed income. They had given Ethan everything they had, and now Ethan intended to give them something back, a house, designed by his own hand, built on land he owned outright, in a neighborhood that was quiet and safe, and lined with mature trees. The irony of that last detail would not be lost on him later. Linda Morrison had lived in Maplewood Ridge for 11 years. She had served as HOA president for 6 of those years, a tenure that had started with genuine enthusiasm for community improvement, and had slowly curdled into something that looked more like a personal fiefdom than a volunteer board position. She was 55 years old, sharp-featured, and possessed of an energy that never seemed to flag, because the energy, as those who knew her well understood, was fueled not by generosity but by the particular satisfaction that comes from telling other people what to do and having them comply. She had strong opinions about fence heights, lawn maintenance schedules, holiday decoration timelines, and the correct species of flowering shrub appropriate for a front garden bed. Most of her neighbors had learned to nod and agree because disagreeing with Linda was an experience that cost more in time and emotional energy than it was worth. She sent emails at 11 at night. She left voicemails on Saturday mornings. She had, on one occasion, photographed a neighbor's outdoor furniture from the sidewalk and submitted the images to the city as evidence of a code violation. Linda Morrison was the kind of person who, given an inch of authority, would meticulously measure out the inch and then demand a mile. And Ethan Carter's vacant lot had been living rent-free in her head since the day he'd bought it. She had started with letters formal HOA correspondence on crisp white paper, delivered to Ethan's rental address, informing him that a vacant lot on Sycamore Crest Lane was in violation of community aesthetic standards, and that he was expected to take immediate corrective action. Ethan had read the first letter carefully, confirmed that he was in full compliance with every actual municipal code and every enforceable HOA regulation, and written back a polite but clear response, explaining that he had active plans for the property and that construction would begin on schedule. Linda had sent a second letter, then a third, then she began calling. Ethan answered the first 2 calls and explained, again, with patience and without hostility, that he understood her concern and that the lot would not remain vacant indefinitely. He was in the permitting process, which anyone familiar with municipal construction timelines would understand could take several months. Linda was not interested in permitting timelines. Linda was interested in results she could see from her car window when she drove past on Tuesday mornings. She wanted to be able to point at something, a manicured hedge, a freshly painted fence, any visible evidence of order, and say to whoever was riding in the passenger seat, "I did that. That is the result of my efforts. That is what this neighborhood looks like, because of me." An empty lot offered her nothing to point at, and nothing to take credit for, and Linda Morrison did not traffic in things she could not take credit for. It was on the 4th phone call that Ethan stopped answering. Not out of rudeness, but out of the practical recognition that the conversation had nowhere productive left to go. He had said what needed to be said. He had confirmed his ownership. He had outlined his plans. He had been unfailingly respectful. And Linda had, on each occasion, responded by suggesting that if he wasn't going to do something with the land, perhaps the community should. Ethan had not taken that suggestion seriously. He would later reflect that this was the single miscalculation of the entire episode, not because he should have acted differently, but because he had briefly underestimated how literally Linda meant what she said. The HOA meeting that Linda convened in late February was officially listed on the agenda as a discussion of community beautification initiatives for the coming spring season. 14 residents attended, which was a higher turnout than usual, because Linda had made the meeting sound important in her email. She presented slides. She talked about curb appeal and property values, and the kind of neighborhood pride that makes a community worth living in. She mentioned, in passing, that there were underutilized spaces in the neighborhood that could be transformed into something everyone could be proud of. Nobody asked which spaces. Nobody asked what transformation meant in practical terms. Nobody asked whether Linda had consulted with the owners of any such spaces, because the meeting moved quickly, and Linda always moved the meeting quickly when she didn't want questions to find their footing. She had a talent for creating the impression of consensus, where none had actually been established, for speaking in the language of collective agreement, while the actual decisions were entirely her own. Residents would leave these meetings feeling vaguely ratified, as though something had been decided together, when in fact the decision had been made before any of them walked through the door. What the 14 residents did not know, what none of them knew until much later, was that Linda had already signed the contracts before the meeting began. The landscaping crew was already scheduled. The trees had already been ordered from a wholesale nursery 2 counties over. The HOA meeting was not a deliberation. It was a press release. The crew arrived on a Tuesday morning with a small excavator, 2 flatbed trucks loaded with red maple saplings, rolls of irrigation tubing, bags of soil amendment, pallets of decorative stone, and sod in tight green rolls. They worked efficiently and without interruption for 3 days. Ethan's lot, which had been a flat expanse of compacted earth interrupted only by a few tufts of wild grass, became something genuinely attractive, a grid of young trees spaced 10 feet apart, underplanted with mulch and edged with smooth river stones, irrigated by a system that ran on a timer, buried in a weatherproof housing near the street. On the 3rd day, when the last stone was placed and the last irrigation head adjusted, Linda walked the entire perimeter with the crew foreman, nodding approvingly. Then she took photographs. She took a great many photographs, from multiple angles, at different times of day to capture the light, and she posted them online to the Maplewood Ridge community page with a caption that read, in full, "Exciting news for our neighborhood. The HOA has successfully transformed an abandoned lot on Sycamore Crest Lane into a beautiful green space for our community to enjoy. Huge thanks to our landscaping partners for bringing this vision to life." This is what community pride looks like. The post received 47 positive reactions and 11 comments, all of them complimentary. Nobody asked about the owner of the lot. Nobody thought to. Ethan found out on a Thursday evening when he drove past the property to take some preliminary measurements for a conversation he had scheduled with his concrete contractor the following week. He slowed the truck to a stop at the edge of the lot and sat there for a long moment, engine idling, staring at what had been done to his land. The red maples were small saplings, really, not yet reaching shoulder height, but there were rows of them, planted in a deliberate grid across the full width and depth of his property. The irrigation heads were visible at regular intervals. The decorative stone edging ran in a clean line along the street frontage. It was, objectively, attractive. It was also, objectively, a violation of his property rights so clear and comprehensive that Ethan's first reaction was not anger but something closer to stunned disbelief. The disbelief of a man who has operated in good faith for 18 months and, like Anne, returned to find that someone had redecorated his living room while he was at work. He sat in the truck for 4 minutes by the dashboard clock. Then he took out his phone, photographed the lot from 6 different positions, made sure his GPS location was embedded in each photograph, and called Gerald Simmons. He called Linda that evening. She answered on the second ring with the cheerful confidence of a woman who had done nothing wrong and knew it. Ethan asked in a measured voice who had authorized the work on his property. Linda explained, in an equally measured voice, that the HOA had voted to improve the neighborhood's green spaces, and that his lot had been selected as the ideal location. Ethan asked her to clarify whether the HOA owned the lot. Linda said that the HOA represented the community, and that the community had a stake in all visible spaces within the neighborhood boundaries. Ethan said that the HOA did not own the lot, that he owned the lot, and that he would need everything removed before his construction permit became active in 4 weeks. Linda said that the trees were now community property and that removing them would be a hostile act against the neighborhood. Ethan said very calmly that he was giving her fair warning and that she should use the time well. Then he ended the call, sat down at his kitchen table, and called his attorney. His attorney was a man named Gerald Simmons, a real estate and property rights lawyer with 30 years of practice in the county. Gerald reviewed the situation in about 15 minutes: Ethan's deed, the HOA governing documents, the applicable state statutes on property trespass and unauthorized improvements, and delivered his assessment with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen versions of this situation before. What Linda had done was a textbook trespass, not a gray area, not a matter of interpretation. She had authorized physical alterations to private property without the consent of the property owner, using funds and contracts she had no legal authority to execute. The HOA governing documents, which Gerald pulled up on his screen while they were still on the phone, were explicit. The association had jurisdiction over common areas and shared spaces, not over privately owned lots within the community boundary. Linda hadn't found a loophole. She had simply ignored the rules entirely and hoped nobody would push back. Gerald drafted a formal cease and desist letter that evening. It went out the next morning, certified mail, addressed to Linda Morrison as HOA president and as an individual. The letter was polite, precise, and left no room for misunderstanding. Ethan Carter was the sole owner of the subject property. All improvements made without his consent were unauthorized, and he would be pursuing legal remedies if the matter was not resolved before his construction commencement date. Linda received the letter on a Monday. She read it. Then she called her own attorney, a man who told her, after reviewing the governing documents, that she was in a difficult position. Linda called that attorney a pessimist and hired a second one. The second attorney told her essentially the same thing, with slightly more diplomatic phrasing. Linda called him risk-averse and began composing her own response, without legal assistance, using HOA letterhead. The response she sent to Ethan was 3 pages long. It argued, with remarkable confidence for a document containing multiple factual errors, that the HOA had an implicit mandate to maintain community aesthetics in all areas visible from public streets, that the trees had increased the value of the surrounding properties, and therefore benefited Ethan as a neighbor, and that Ethan was morally obligated to acknowledge the community's good intentions rather than threatening litigation. Attached to the letter was an invoice. The invoice itemized the cost of the landscaping project in full: the trees, the sod, the irrigation system, the labor, the decorative stone, and presented a total of $48,320. At the bottom of the invoice, in bold text, was a note: payment due within 30 days. Non-payment will result in a formal HOA fine and may affect your standing in the community. Ethan read the invoice once, set it on his desk, and sent a single email to Gerald Simmons that read, "She sent an invoice." Gerald's response, which arrived 12 minutes later, contained only 4 words: "I'll handle it from here." Gerald would later tell Ethan, over a brief call that evening, that in 30 years of property law practice, he had encountered aggressive HOA presidents, unreasonable neighbors, and disputes that defied ordinary logic, but that receiving a demand for payment from the person whose unauthorized actions had caused the problem was, in terms of sheer audacity, in a category of its own. Ethan said he wasn't surprised. Gerald said he was going to enjoy this one. What followed was 3 weeks during which Linda Morrison demonstrated with increasing clarity that she had mistaken Ethan's patience for weakness. She sent 2 more letters expanding on the HOA's authority. She left a voicemail for Ethan's concrete contractor, suggesting that the project might face community opposition. She organized an informal gathering of neighbors at which she presented the landscaping project as a done deal and Ethan's objections as the work of a difficult, antisocial property owner who didn't care about the neighborhood. She posted updates online calling the trees a gift to the community that no individual should be able to take back. She sent Ethan a formal HOA fine notice, $250, for what she described as threatening behavior toward community landscaping. Through all of it, Ethan did not respond publicly. He did not post anything. He did not speak to neighbors about it. He finished his pre-construction meetings with his contractors, confirmed his materials delivery schedule, double-checked his permits, and waited for the date that was already printed on his construction authorization paperwork. He did, however, warn Linda again. In person this time, on a Saturday morning 2 weeks before his permit became active. He walked across the street to where she was collecting her mail, and he told her, without raising his voice, that he was giving her a final opportunity to have the trees removed from his property at her own expense before his construction crew arrived. He told her the start date, He told her the time, 6 in the morning. He told her that once his crew began work, anything on the land would be treated as a construction obstacle, which was the standard and legal procedure under his permits. Linda looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You won't do it. Those trees belong to this neighborhood now, and you know it." Ethan looked at her for an equally long moment, nodded once, and walked back to his truck. He had delivered his warnings. He had documented every one of them. He was done talking. The morning of the construction start date arrived with the kind of quiet clarity that spring mornings sometimes produce: cool air, pale light, birds just beginning to establish the day's first arguments in the trees along the street. The birds, notably, were not singing in Ethan's trees, because Ethan's trees were the open sky above a vacant lot. At 5:58 in the morning, the first truck turned onto Sycamore Crest Lane. It was a heavy equipment transport carrying the largest of the 6 excavators, a full-size machine with a reach of 22 feet and a bucket capacity that could lift a mature tree without straining. Behind it came the second transport, and then the third, and then the crew vehicles, and then the equipment trailers, until the street in front of Ethan's lot was lined with construction machinery in a way that made the neighborhood look, briefly, like a staging ground for something of significant scale, which it was. Porch lights clicked on in the houses across the street. A dog somewhere began to bark, and then was hushed. Curtains shifted. The machinery was not particularly subtle, and the neighborhood had not yet had occasion to process the fact that a construction project of this size had been waiting, patiently and legally, for precisely this moment. The site foreman was a man named Dale Hutchins, who had worked with Ethan on 3 previous projects and ran his crews with the calm authority of someone who had heard every possible objection to every possible construction scenario and had the paperwork to answer each one. Dale walked the perimeter with his site coordinator at 6 o'clock sharp, reviewed the permits one final time, coordinated the equipment positioning, and gave the signal to begin at 6:07. The first excavator moved into position with the methodical patience of something very large and very certain of its purpose. Linda Morrison appeared at 6:14. She came out of her front door wearing what she would later describe, to anyone who would listen, as her HOA official capacity outfit, a pressed blazer over her morning clothes, a lanyard with her HOA president identification card, and the expression of a woman who fully expected that the sight of her crossing the street would be sufficient to halt 6 pieces of heavy construction equipment. She was wrong about that. She planted herself at the edge of Ethan's lot and held both hands up, which the excavator operator did not see because he was focused on his work. She shouted for the machines to stop. The machines did not stop. Dale Hutchins walked over to her, introduced himself as the site foreman, and asked, in a professionally neutral tone, whether she had documentation demonstrating an ownership interest in the property. Linda said that the HOA managed this area. Dale said that was not the same as an ownership interest, and produced the construction permits, the property deed certified copy, and the authorization letter from Gerald Simmons's office. He spread them out on the hood of a work truck and invited Linda to review them. Linda did not review them. Linda took out her phone and began live streaming. She narrated what she was seeing with the urgent energy of someone who believes that a large enough audience will generate its own kind of authority. She described the machinery as destroying community property. She called it an attack on the neighborhood. She appealed to her viewers, whoever happened to be watching a live stream at 6:15 on a weekday morning, to come to Sycamore Crest Lane and stand with the community. 2 neighbors arrived within 20 minutes, curious rather than outraged, and stood on the sidewalk watching. Then 3 more. Then a small cluster of perhaps 8 people formed on the public sidewalk along the property line, watching the excavator reach into the earth and lift the first maple tree free of the ground with a sound like tearing fabric roots and soil and irrigation line all coming up together in a slow, inexorable arc. The tree was loaded onto a flatbed in under 4 minutes. Linda's live stream captured the moment in full, which would later prove to be one of the more consequential decisions she made during this entire episode, though not for the reasons she intended. The second tree followed, then the third. Dale's crew worked with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had been given a clear objective and had no personal stake in the drama unfolding at the edge of the site. Ethan arrived at 7:30, parked his truck behind the equipment transports, and stood at the edge of the activity with a cup of coffee in his hand and the expression of a man watching something proceed exactly as planned. He did not speak to Linda. He did not look at the camera. He spoke with Dale briefly, reviewed the morning's progress, confirmed a few details about the afternoon's schedule, and went to sit in his truck and make calls. By 9 in the morning, Linda had exhausted her live stream audience's patience and was on the phone with the non-emergency police line. She reported, in quick succession, destruction of property, trespassing, and what she described as unauthorized removal of community assets. The dispatcher sent a patrol unit. Officer Christine Varela arrived at 9:22, took one look at the scene, and asked Dale for the permits. Dale provided them. Officer Varela spent 12 minutes reviewing the documentation, the deed, the construction authorization, the HOA governing documents that Gerald Simmons had helpfully included with annotations highlighting the sections relevant to private property jurisdiction. She then approached Linda and explained, in the careful language of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news to people who are not inclined to hear it, that the construction was being conducted lawfully on private property by the property owner and that there was nothing the police could do to intervene. Linda asked Officer Varela if she was certain. Officer Varela said she was certain. Linda asked if there was a supervisor she could speak to. Officer Varela said she could file a formal inquiry at the precinct, but that it would not affect the current situation. Then, Officer Varela also noted, quietly but clearly, that Linda might wish to consult an attorney about her own potential exposure regarding the unauthorized alterations that had been made to the property, because entering someone's private land without permission and making permanent improvements to it without consent was itself a legal matter of some seriousness. Linda did not respond to that observation. She turned and looked at the excavator, which had continued working throughout the entirety of the conversation with the officer, indifferent to the legal discussion unfolding 30 feet away, interested only in the next tree. Linda also called the City Code Enforcement Office. An inspector arrived at 11 and reviewed the permits. Linda called the County Planning Office. A representative confirmed by phone that Ethan's permits were valid and properly issued. By noon, Linda had made 7 phone calls to various government offices and received the same answer from each one. The construction was lawful. Ethan was within his rights. The trees were being removed from private property by its owner. Nothing about this was actionable by any authority Linda had reached. The neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk had, by this point, begun asking questions among themselves that Linda would have preferred they not ask. The most important of these questions was a simple one. Had the person who owned this lot given the HOA permission to plant trees on it? The answer, which became clear through the natural circulation of information among people standing in proximity to each other for several hours, was no. Nobody had seen any consent documentation. Nobody remembered a vote on this specific action at any HOA meeting. A woman named Patricia Lund, who had been a Maplewood Ridge resident for 9 years and had attended every HOA meeting in that time, said with increasing certainty that she could not recall any vote authorizing work on a privately owned lot. Another neighbor, a retired contractor named Bill Sawyer, looked at the irrigation system that was being excavated and said, to no one in particular, that it was a nice system, expensive, and asked where the money for it had come from. These questions did not have comfortable answers, and Linda, who was still on her phone making calls, was not in a position to provide them. By 3 in the afternoon, the lot was 60% cleared. The flatbed trucks had made 2 runs to the tree disposal facility and returned for a 3rd load. The irrigation system had been excavated and set aside. Gerald Simmons had instructed Dale's crew to document every component removed from the site, with photographs and an itemized log, for purposes that would become clear in the following weeks. The decorative stone had been removed and piled at the site edge. The sod was gone, revealing the compacted earth beneath it, which the crew would assess for soil condition before the foundation work began. By 5 in the afternoon, when the light was going golden and the temperature had dropped enough that the neighbors still on the sidewalk had their arms crossed against the chill, the last maple tree was loaded onto the final flatbed truck, and the lot was clear. Completely, entirely, legally clear. Ethan stood at the edge of his property in the fading light and looked at what his land looked like again. Open, flat, ready. He allowed himself one moment of quiet satisfaction, not the hot satisfaction of revenge, but the cooler, steadier satisfaction of a man who had been methodical and patient and was now seeing the result of that methodology. Then he got back in his truck. The legal documents that arrived at Linda Morrison's home 3 days later were prepared by Gerald Simmons's office and were thorough in the way that only documents prepared by attorneys who have been thoroughly provoked can be. They outlined the claim against Linda Morrison, personally, and against the Maplewood Ridge HOA, jointly, for damages arising from unauthorized trespass and alteration of private property. The itemized damages were detailed across 6 categories. The first was the cost of clearing the trees and irrigation system from the site. This was Ethan's direct out-of-pocket expense for the removal work, which had not been part of his original construction budget and had required mobilizing equipment on an accelerated schedule. The second was the cost of soil assessment and remediation, because the irrigation lines had introduced moisture patterns into the subsoil that Ethan's geotechnical engineer needed to evaluate before foundation work could safely proceed an assessment that had not been necessary before. The unauthorized improvements were installed. The third was the construction schedule delay every day. The construction start was pushed back, had a calculable cost in contractor time, equipment, rental extensions, and materials holding fees, all of which Gerald's office had documented with precision. The fourth was the surveying work required to confirm that no underground elements of the irrigation system remained in positions that would interfere with the foundation plan. The fifth was the legal fees incurred from the first cease and desist letter through the current filing. The sixth was a general damages claim for the interference with Ethan's property rights. The total, when all 6 categories were added together, was $122,400 and some change. Gerald's cover letter was 1 paragraph. It informed Linda that a response was expected within 14 days and that Ethan Carter was prepared to proceed to filing if the matter was not resolved. Linda read the letter in her kitchen and then sat very still for a while. The number $122,000 was not a number she had anticipated. The $48,000 invoice she had sent Ethan seemed in retrospect to belong to a much smaller and simpler universe than the one she currently occupied. She called the HOA's general counsel, a part-time arrangement the association had with a local firm for routine matters, and asked whether the HOA could be held liable for her actions. The attorney, who had not been consulted before the landscaping project and was hearing about it now for the first time in full detail, was quiet for a moment before responding. He said that if Linda had used HOA funds to finance the project and had signed contracts using HOA authority without proper board authorization, the exposure to the association was real and significant. He asked her to describe the authorization process she had used. Linda described it. There was another silence. The attorney then said, carefully, that he strongly advised Linda to inform the HOA board of the full situation before they heard about it from the other side's attorneys. Linda called a board meeting instead of following that advice, a meeting she framed, in the email she sent to the 4 other board members, as a legal update requiring confidential discussion. What she did not anticipate was that Gerald Simmons's office had also sent a copy of the demand letter to the HOA's registered address, addressed to the board of directors collectively, and that 2 of the board members had already received and read it before they walked into the meeting. The meeting that Linda had planned as a controlled information session became, within 10 minutes, something much less controlled. The board members had questions. They had very specific questions about how the landscaping project had been authorized, whose name was on the contracts, which account the payment had come from, and whether there was a vote of the membership anywhere in the record that supported the action. Linda answered these questions with increasing difficulty. She said the project had been approved at the February meeting. One board member produced the February meeting minutes, which he had printed from the HOA's records. The minutes contained no motion, no vote, and no record of any discussion related to the Sycamore Crest lot specifically. Linda said the approval had been implicit in the broader beautification discussion. Another board member said that implicit authorization was not how HOA governance worked and asked to see the contracts Linda had signed. Linda said she didn't have them with her. A third board member said that if HOA funds had been used to finance an unauthorized improvement on a privately owned lot, every member of the board had potential exposure, and he was not comfortable with that. The full community meeting that followed 2 weeks later was a different kind of gathering entirely from the cozy, low-attendance sessions Linda had cultivated over her years as president. 61 residents attended. The room was a middle school gymnasium borrowed for the occasion, and the folding chairs were arranged in rows that faced a table where the board members sat, and, at one end of the table, Linda sat as well, though with considerably less authority than she had occupied at every previous such gathering. A resident named Marcus Webb, who worked as an accountant and had been looking at the HOA's financial records since the legal demand letter arrived in his inbox. He was on the finance subcommittee, a role Linda had offered him 2 years ago, precisely because he seemed agreeable, stood up and presented what he had found. What Marcus Webb had found was that the $48,000 spent on the Sycamore Crest landscaping project had come from the HOA's Capital Improvement Reserve Fund. The reserve fund existed for legitimate capital improvements to common areas, repaving the shared path, repairing the entrance signage, maintaining the actual common area plantings near the main road. It did not exist for unauthorized improvements to private lots. More importantly, what Marcus Webb had found was that Linda had signed the contracts not as an individual but as HOA president, which meant the association was on record as the contracting party, which meant the HOA's funds and the HOA's legal standing were both entangled in whatever came next. The room absorbed this information in the particular silence of people processing the gap between what they had been told and what was actually true. Then someone pulled up Linda's original online post, the one with the photographs, the caption about community pride, the 47 reactions and 11 comments, and projected it on the gymnasium wall via a laptop and a borrowed projector. And then someone else pulled up the first warning email that Ethan's attorney had sent, and the second, and the third, and the copies of the certified mail receipts showing that Linda had received each one. And then someone read aloud the section of the HOA governing documents that specified, in plain and unambiguous language, that the association had no authority over privately owned lots within the community boundary. The room absorbed that too. Linda attempted to speak twice. The first time, she offered a reframing. She said that her intentions had been good, that she had acted in the interest of the community, and that if Ethan Carter had been a better neighbor and communicated his plans more clearly, none of this would have been necessary. This reframing was not received well. A woman named Helen Chu, who had lived in Maplewood Ridge for 14 years and had never once raised her voice at an HOA meeting, stood up and said that Ethan Carter had communicated clearly in at least 3 documented communications and that perhaps the problem was not his communication but someone else's listening. The second time Linda attempted to speak, she began to make a point about the legal process being preliminary and not yet resolved, and Marcus Webb produced the certified mail receipt showing Linda had received Gerald Simmons' demand letter 11 days ago and had not informed the board. The room was no longer interested in Linda Morrison's framing of events. The vote was called at 9:47 in the evening. It was a formal motion to remove Linda Morrison from the position of HOA president, effective immediately, and to seat the vice president in an acting capacity pending a proper election. The vote was not close. 44 in favor, 9 opposed, 8 abstentions. Linda Morrison was no longer president of the Maplewood Ridge HOA. She left the gymnasium without speaking to anyone. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. What she was thinking during that time, no one could say she was alone, and the particular interior life of a person confronting the full weight of their own miscalculation is not a thing that translates easily into words. What she had done had seemed, from the inside, like an act of service. She had looked at an empty lot and seen an opportunity to make something beautiful, and she had made it beautiful, and she had expected to be thanked for it. The idea that the law might not share her aesthetic priorities, that it might care more about a deed of ownership than about the niceness of 50 red maple trees, had not fully registered as a real possibility until the excavators arrived. And even then, watching the trees come out of the ground, some part of her had still believed that the rightness of her intentions would assert itself as a kind of protection. It had not. Intentions, as any competent attorney could have told her, do not appear on deeds of title. They do not satisfy the elements of consent under property law. They do not stay the hand of a lawfully permitted construction crew. They are not, in any jurisdiction, a substitute for permission. Linda had built her entire justification on the architecture of her own goodwill, and goodwill, it turned out, had no load-bearing capacity whatsoever. The settlement was reached 6 weeks later. Linda Morrison, personally, agreed to pay a portion of the damages. The HOA, after extensive internal deliberation and a formal authorization vote by the full membership, the kind of deliberate, documented, properly authorized vote that had been conspicuously absent from Linda's original decision-making process, agreed to contribute to the remainder from the reserve fund, with a repayment schedule attached, so that individual homeowners' fees would not increase. Gerald Simmons reviewed the settlement and confirmed it was acceptable. Ethan signed it on a Wednesday afternoon in Gerald's office, put the folder in his truck, and drove to the construction site. The house was already taking shape by then. The foundation had been poured 6 weeks after the clearing, once the soil assessments were complete. The framing had gone up fast. Ethan's contractor was good, and his crew was motivated by the clean simplicity of the design, a single-story ranch with generous windows and a wide covered porch that wrapped around the southern and western exposures. June Carter had asked for a garden, and Ethan had designed a raised bed system along the eastern side of the property that would catch the morning light. Raymond Carter had asked for a workshop space, and there was a detached garage with wiring and ventilation appropriate for a man who had spent 3 decades walking and wanted something to do with his hands in retirement. The house was not large. It was exactly the right size. The months that followed saw the neighborhood undergo a quiet recalibration. Ethan's house was completed in late August, a clean, well-proportioned structure that sat on its lot with the confidence of something designed by someone who knew what he was doing. The landscaping that Ethan installed was not elaborate. A native grass lawn, 3 flowering dogwood trees positioned to provide afternoon shade on the porch, a row of boxwoods along the property line, and June Carter's raised vegetable beds, already planted with the optimism of a first season. It was nothing like the grid of red maples that had briefly occupied the land. It was better because it belonged there. Several neighbors came to the front door in the weeks after the Carters moved in. They came with food, mostly a casserole, a pie, a tray of cookies, and with the slightly awkward body language of people who want to apologize but are not entirely sure how to begin. Ethan accepted each visit with the same equanimity he had brought to the entire situation. He did not make anyone feel worse than they already felt. He understood that most of his neighbors had not been malicious. They had simply trusted a person who had positioned herself as an authority and had not thought to question whether that authority was legitimate. Patricia Lund came twice, and on the second visit said directly that she was sorry for not asking harder questions at the February meeting. Ethan said he appreciated that, offered her a seat on the porch, and they had a conversation about something else entirely, about his father's plans for the workshop, about the particular kind of cherry tomato his mother had always grown and was trying again in the raised beds. It was a pleasant conversation, entirely ordinary, which was perhaps the best possible outcome of the preceding months. The Maplewood Ridge HOA, under its new leadership, the acting president was a soft-spoken retired librarian named Carol Jennings, who had accepted the role with visible reluctance and held it with visible conscientiousness, undertook a thorough revision of its governing procedures. Carol was not a woman who enjoyed the exercise of authority for its own sake, which made her, paradoxically, considerably more effective at it than her predecessor. She read the governing documents from beginning to end before her first official act. She asked the community's legal counsel to identify every provision that was ambiguous or that had been applied incorrectly under the previous administration. She held 2 working sessions, open to any resident who wished to attend, at which the proposed revisions were discussed line by line before being voted on. The process was slow and occasionally tedious, and attendance at the working sessions was modest. Most people, having seen where unchecked enthusiasm for HOA governance could lead, were content to stay home and trust that Carol would handle it sensibly. She did. The revised rules, which were adopted at a properly noticed and properly documented membership meeting in October, contained 3 new provisions that had not existed before. The first specified that no HOA representative, officer, or contractor could enter, alter, or make improvements to any privately owned lot within the community boundary without a signed written consent from the property owner. The second required that any landscaping or improvement project exceeding $5,000 in HOA funds required a formal vote of the full membership rather than board approval alone. The third removed the HOA president's unilateral authority to sign contracts on behalf of the association above a threshold of $2,500. These rules were not radical. They were, Carol Jennings observed at the meeting where they were adopted, simply the rules that should have existed already. Linda Morrison remained in Maplewood Ridge. She attended no community events for the remainder of the year. Her garden, on her own property, was immaculate, as it always had been, maintained with the same focused energy she had once brought to managing everyone else's spaces. She trimmed her hedges on schedule. She swept her walkway on Saturday mornings. She kept her holiday decorations within the window, specified in the HOA calendar, the same calendar she had written herself years ago, and which the new board had left unchanged in that particular detail because it was, on the matter of holiday decorations, perfectly reasonable. Whether she regretted what had happened was not something she discussed with anyone. Whether she understood it fully was, perhaps, a more complicated question. The conviction that one's good intentions confer a kind of legal immunity is a remarkably persistent one, and it does not dissolve easily, even in the face of evidence, even in the face of 44 votes at a gymnasium meeting on a Tuesday night, or $122,000 in legal exposure, or the sight of 6 excavators dismantling in a single day what had taken 3 days to build. Some lessons require a long time to settle into the places where they are actually needed. On a Saturday morning in late September, Ethan stood on the covered porch of the house he had built and watched his father walk the perimeter of the yard with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had spent 32 years covering other people's routes and was now learning to simply look at his own ground. Raymond Carter stopped at the eastern bed where June was kneeling in the soil, adjusting something, and he said something to her that Ethan couldn't hear, and she laughed. It was the specific laugh of a woman who had spent 27 years in a classroom and had earned, many times over, the right to laugh on a Saturday morning in her own garden. Ethan held his coffee with both hands and looked at the yard, the dogwoods, the boxwoods, the native grass catching the September light, and felt something settle in him that had been slightly unsettled for the better part of 2 years. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter than either of those. The house existed because he had been patient and precise, and had not deviated from the understanding that ownership means something, that the law is a structure with weight and load-bearing capacity, and that the correct response to someone building without authorization on your foundation is not to argue about their intentions but to enforce your plans. He had not shouted. He had not threatened. He had warned, documented, waited, and acted in exactly that order, and the outcome had been exactly what that sequence, followed correctly, was designed to produce. He thought, briefly, about the 50 red maples. Somewhere, presumably, they had been replanted. Most of the trees had been viable when removed, and he had instructed the crew to deliver them to a municipal nursery rather than a disposal site. He didn't know where they had ended up. He hoped they were doing well, in whatever soil they now occupied, in whatever place someone had chosen for them with the appropriate permissions. The trees themselves had done nothing wrong. They had simply been planted in the wrong place, by the wrong hands, without the consent that the law requires and that basic respect between neighbors demands. The morning moved on. September light changed direction on the porch boards. Inside, he could hear his mother moving in the kitchen, the particular sound of a person making themselves at home in a space that has been made for them, the specific music of drawers being opened and closed, with the confidence of someone who has learned where everything is, the sound of water running, the smell of coffee that drifted through the screen door and reached him on the porch. Raymond appeared at the corner of the house and raised a hand to Ethan, a small gesture. A simple one, and Ethan raised his coffee in return. Down the street, the neighborhood went about its Saturday. A car pulled out of a driveway. Someone's dog crossed a lawn on a leash. A sprinkler came on somewhere, and the sound of it carried in the still morning air, that particular rhythmic percussion of water moving through a well-designed system. Ethan finished his coffee and went inside to help his mother with breakfast. The lot on Sycamore Crest Lane was empty no longer. It held a house, and the house held a family, and the family was exactly where it was supposed to be. The name on the deed was the same name it had always been. The plans that had been filed with the county were the plans that had been built. The permit that had been issued had been honored, the warnings that had been given had been documented, and the law that had been patient had, in the end, been exactly as effective as it was designed to be. Some things, when you build them correctly, from the ground up, with patience and precision, and an accurate understanding of what belongs to whom, some things simply work out the way they should. Not easily, and not without cost, but correctly. And correctly in the end is the only way that matters.